Thank you all for joining us today. I am Caruthers, president of PAEA, and I am excited to have this conversation with our Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Monica Miles, who we had the good foresight of hiring at PAEA. She has done some fantastic work, not only in looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice for our association. She's also been doing some really critical work with our research team in building that out and just really pulling together some good research questions that we need to think about as PAs as well as PA educators. So today we're going to have a conversation as it is Black History Month. We are celebrating, we're highlighting the celebration of Black history during February, but it is something that we definitely lift up and we celebrate throughout the year. So we're going to have a discussion about both the PAEA Vignette Project, as well as we're going to talk about this month, how it is also Black health and wellness. And so again, thank you, Dr. Miles, for joining me today to have this conversation.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. I think it's exciting to dig deeper into this work. As we've kind of talked about the Vignette Project, it went from hey, this would be interesting to capture some of these stories that we, especially as minoritized people, especially as Black people, we've had these conversations. So here's a way of sharing stories that have been said to me, right, and rewriting them to put them out in a way that they become learning opportunities for others. So I'm just excited, and I just want to thank up front the brave folks that have shared their personal stories for us to center their experiences also.
All right, absolutely. Because I know as I've seen some of the vignettes and have participated in some discussions, they are things that are very timely. But do you mind sharing like what prompted you, why did you feel it was necessary for PAEA to have such a project for other PA educators to see some of what's going on for Black and Brown PA educators?
Absolutely. So for those of you that have not personally connected with Shawnee Fleming, I strongly encourage you to do so. It started as a conversation between the two of us. I've used vignettes in some of my research to like highlight an event. And so in the research space, I call them critical incidents, but they're really vignettes. So they're just short little stories that kind of tell you what happened, at least from the perspective of one person. And especially from critical race theory, we really need to center and think about how are minoritized people experiencing their environments, right? And so not only honoring their experience, but saying, that's their truth, right? And so, also learning those things from critical race theory. So I use critical race theory heavily in my work and using things like counter narrative, although I've never done it in quite this way. And it was really connecting with two different groups, and I'll give them a shout out here. One is the Black folks, kind of like text group, if you will, and then there's also the Melanin Magic, right, group that Shawnee kind of leads quarterly. And one of the things I could say as being newer to my roles, I've only been here a year, I was overwhelmingly welcomed by the Black faculty and Black administrators, and they began to share their stories, right, and things that they wanted me to learn. And as a qualitative researcher and a critical race theorist, I'm kind of like, wow, these are powerful experiences, but they're not happening in isolation, right? So, and talking with Shawnee, we were like, let's start to, what would it be for us to capture these stories? And so it went from, oh, that's a cool idea, to let's actually do it and put it out there and see what happens. And so that's what you're seeing is an idea that we believed in enough to ask people, are you willing to share your story with me in a short conversation? And I'll write it up and I'll send it back to you and ensure that I've honored what you've said and that it's, de-identified and things like that. And so that's kind of where it came from. And we're excited to see, where it goes. But I have been just like shocked by a lot of the responses that I've gotten based on the project.
That is awesome. So you've mentioned this a couple of times, and unfortunately, critical race theory has become a buzzword that has more of a negative connotation versus the value denotation of really what it is. Do you mind, in simplistic form, for people that don't know, aren't in some of these spaces, right? What is race theory, and why is it important for us to talk about race and the experiences of minoritized populations within PA education?
Absolutely. And as a critical race theorist, I'm actually excited that people talk about critical race theory, because if you would have had this conversation with me like 5 years ago, we always had to start every paper with explaining in great detail the history of critical race theory. Why is it interdisciplinary? Why more disciplines need to pick it up? So it's almost like you're actually you're I don't have to have that conversation anymore. It's more like, well, what is this buzzword? And so as a critical race theorist, I'm actually kind of excited that's kind of happening, you know. But I would say that in its simplistic form, critical race theory allows me as a researcher and a practitioner to say racism exists. My job is not to prove that it exists, but what does it look like and how does it manifest? Also, as a critical race theorist, we know that racism morphs and changes over time. And just as it morphs and changes over time, we too have to change our approaches to dismantling and combating. And we have to be just as rigorous, because the way racism operates and white supremacy and all of those things, they are always 5 steps ahead, right? They have the power. And one of the things that I've used in some of my pieces is I say focus on whiteness as property, right? And that tenet really comes from the legal field, where originally white people were the only ones that were able to own land. And it appears in many ways in our common way of being. So right, it shows up in assessment. Whose knowledge is valued? Whose culture is valued, right? The different ways of knowing and being. So I've used it in that way to say, this is how whiteness as property operates now, right? So it's not as, although we can have that argument about redlining and things like that. But one of the things we know is that racism is normalized. And so it is how society operates. However, minoritized people typically, not always, but typically are the ones to say, that's not right. Right, because they're on the receiving end of the injustices. So, if you were to ask me in its simplistic form, is that it's the way society is structured, right, in both overt and covert ways, to normalize the mistreatment and the devaluing of people that are not a part of the dominant group, which in the United States would be, white, middle class, mainstream. Those are the words that people would kind of use. So that's how I would describe it.
All right, so I'm going to add and push just a little bit more, because I think, at least, from some conversations that I've had, it seems that the resistance to talking about critical race theory and talking about racism is that we think of racism only from an individual level. We're like, well, I'm not racist because I don't treat Black people this way. I don't treat people that are of Asian descent this way. I don't treat people that are disabled this way, right? So we think of it as individualized versus thinking of it, no, racism is a system. Racism is across institutions. And the work that we have to commit to as individuals is to dismantle racism and supremacist ideology at institutional and systemic levels, not meaning that you're not a good person. Because I think sometimes people hear these words, they're like, well, I'm a good person, I don't do this. And this isn't about your morality. This is about how is our system set up, and how does our system collectively marginalize people? How does PA education marginalize specific people? And then that really then says, well, we're PA educators, we're PAEA, man, this is something that we can do to address this, versus assigning if we're good or bad, right?
Absolutely. And Kara, I just love that about you, right? So one of the things is that that's honestly a very so if you're thinking about the way race scholars address race, that's actually a very it's like a lower level understanding. right? Because we're talking about me and I'm personalizing everything, right? And so you've already pointed out how these things are systemic. And again, that goes back to normalizing. One of the things I began to do in some of my work is actually push against some of these things that we say systemic and say, who created that policy? How was that even how was that even okay when they noticed the major trends in the data? So for example, who's creating your admissions policies? Who's implementing those practices for you to maintain racist practices? It becomes, again, it's a way of renormalizing the thing that we're trying to combat. And so I think one of the things about talking about things as systemic, when we say that, is what is happening to patterns of people that lets us know that this is the way in which race and racism are operating in this space, right? So when we look at things like learning outcomes, right? So, and here's a here's one of the things that we learned in some of the K-12 STEM literature. When Black and brown students, when they participate on the lower end of whatever the outcomes are, right? We can talk about literacy, we can talk about math, pick a subject, it doesn't matter. As long as they're at the bottom, we're still operating okay. If that and when that paradigm shifts, because it has, and white students are now participating below Black and brown students, the dialogue shifts. And Danny Martin talks about that. It's now an issue with the test, right? Something is wrong with this test or this environment for these outcomes to appear in this way. And he said, well, that's because you were okay with actually maintaining those racist outcomes. I mean, and you could talk about everything from intelligence testing, it has its history in all of these places and spaces. And what would it mean for us to say, racism is in every space that I occupy. My job is to identify it, right? And so as a critical race theorist, we always say race is first, right? So you're always going to have a race issue. And then we also talk about other minoritized identities, right? And then how are they? So thinking about just even who I am and who you are, Kara, right? So you have this layer of being a Black woman, you have, well, being Black and then a woman, right? And then you add any other identity that's marginalized, right? It becomes the multiplicative ways in which we coexist in these spaces, right? You can add disability, right? That's a whole nother layer that we don't, and that's one of the things that Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in intersectionality. We're okay with dealing with a monolith. What does it mean to be Black? You add gender, we then start to not know what to do with you. And in research, we really stink at this, because if you go beyond two variables, we are like, well, what does it mean for you to be, let's say you're a Black woman who's Muslim, and then you wear a hijab. We don't know what to do in the research space because we have not allowed Black people to be diverse themselves. And so because we homogenize, we get stuck in our thinking.
Ooh, so clearly, we could just talk about this for this entire hour, but we have a little bit more to go on. But I think that is a great background for people that aren't in the space, may not be familiar with critical race theory, may not just in their, if you will, social sphere, just may not have access to people that are other, right, than them. And so kind of with the work that you do, with just the intentionality, thinking about research, like what is your hope? What are some takeaways that you want PA educators and PA staff to really get from this Vignette Project?
Is that I would just say these stories are real, right? And that is a critical race theory approach, is that these aren't things that I made up on my way, when I'm drinking my coffee in the morning, like, oh, this would be fun just to make this up. Is that, no, this is someone's real narrative. This is their perception of an event that has occurred. And so when I have these conversations, I typically ask, is there an event that you could think about that you realize your race was salient in that moment? So when you read these stories, right, and when you read them, think about, that's what somebody said. And you know what? They don't have to pause and think about it. They're like, I have the perfect story. I have other stories too, right? I knew when, like say my gender was more salient than my race, right? And so or it was the both of them at the same time. So it's like these are so clear to people, right? In the ways in which they were treated. And a lot of it is subtle. And I think that's the part that the profession can contend with, right? So it's asking themselves, what does it look like here? And realizing if you start with this isn't our problem, or we're anti-racist and so on and so forth, well then that means it's a part of the problem because it's normalized. So how are you pushing back and combating all the time? Right. And so you can identify what is the most marginalized group in this space, whether they're there or they're not. Right. So it's not just recognizing marginalized identities when they're present. What does it mean when they're not there? Right? How does it show up in our curriculum? How does it show up in our discourse? What do we do when somebody is harmed? Right? Is restorative justice something? Do people have, because when I tell you faculty are like, I want to share my story too, often it's because no one's listening to or thinking about what is the narrative here. And I've heard several responses from people, right? So some of our let's say typically our white counterparts, when they hear these stories, a lot of them are shocked. Like, there's a shock factor, like, oh my gosh, right? Then we have, let's say it's a minoritized person that reads it. They get really upset because they're like, this story resonates with me, and I'm so upset that this was somebody else's truth, right? And then there's the person that this is their story. And while they may be hurt, because I asked them, how did you feel when that happened? Right? These are their feelings because I asked, and they feel validated. So there's an empowering moment that hopefully by sharing this story in this way, that it becomes a teachable moment, that it is then nobody's truth moving forward. And so I think there's a spectrum, right? And we're also collecting stories from allies. And when it's like that scene in the Matrix, right? Where you take the red pill, the blue pill. Once you start to see it, it becomes hard to not see it, right? And so just remembering that everyone has a role and responsibility in this work. And if you're not engaging in this work, well, then you're complacent and you're a part of the problem, right? And so you're perpetuating what will normally happen if you're business as usual, right? When you disrupt, or in this case, provide a discrepant event, because that's sometimes what I call them, is it's you provide an opportunity where people are like, did that, did does this happen here? Have you asked? Is there a safe space for you to have this dialogue? What would it mean for you to engage in this conversation? Have you asked your faculty, what are the ways in which racism has appeared in this space? And how can we combat it, right? Are those the conversations that programs are having? I'm not totally sure based on some of the rapid response data that we've gotten there. I think we have a lot of mission statements, and that's kind of where programs are falling flat after that, is what I would say.
Nice. Yeah, I will say the vignette that was in the networker this week, it resonated with me. Because, do I have stories? I have stories. I haven't submitted one yet. It's about me having the time and capacity to write something up. But that one for sure resonated with me because, there was a program that I was at, and there was an issue that came up with our admissions person. And there was some information that was shared that highlighted the racial categories of students and all of this. And it was just inappropriate, right? The way it was shared. And so I said something because I was like, oh, wait a minute now. Oh, this is not right. And it was, the person was upset that I called them out on it. And so came to my office and I'm talking. And so I'm sharing why this was problematic. And they didn't like that. So they ran and told my department chair. And I got an email summons because my body language showed that I was angry and that I didn't believe them. And so I go and I was like, oh, okay, I know a dog whistle when I hear one. And so I went down to the department chair's office. And so the department chair kind of came at me a little aggressively, and I said, hey, here's what we're not going to do. We are not going to buy into the angry Black woman trope. This was done. This was wrong. I notified the person what was done. Someone who was impacted by it reached out to me because it caused them harm, and they didn't feel like they were in a position of power to do anything about it. I was in a position of power as opposed to the other person. So yes, I advocated for them. And so the department chair and I was like, yeah, no, we're not doing this. I said, this is what happened. This is what needs to be corrected. This should never happen again with the person that was in charge of doing admissions work. Should never happen. And so to be upset with me and say, well, Kara made me feel uncomfortable. Why? Because you did the wrong thing? I'm just saying, hey, we have to do better, because this is a problem. And again, it was me speaking up and saying, we can't continue this practice because this is harmful. And so I think that leads to, something else, that I think sometimes we have good intent and we rest on our intent, but my intentions were good. But to be emotionally intelligent, to be proactive, to be, as Susan Layla Shore would say, to be a co-conspirator, it's speaking out when things are causing harm and taking ownership of the impact that our good intent may have, but owning that our impact has been harmful. And so I'm hopeful that with this Vignette Project, as people read it, even though it may not be their personal experience, because they may not identify as a minoritized group, or again, another marginalized label, but I hope they can recognize it doesn't matter if your intent is good. If harm is done, we have to take ownership of that, and we have to then correct the problem. And that then goes back to, how do we ensure our systems? How do we ensure our programs? How do we ensure our admissions practices? How do we ensure our curriculum is not causing harm to the students that we serve? And so for me, that's what I hope, at least in the immediate, but I'm going to pitch it back to you. How do you hope this project is going to shift how our profession, how our organization is going to look like in 50 years?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, my hope is that this will turn into a faculty retention effort, right? And so as we looked and thought about the resources available, it was sparse as it related to underrepresented in medicine faculty, period, right? And so how do we want to have retention and recruitment efforts if we haven't really thought about the experiences? And I'll be very transparent. We recognized quickly as a research team, our instruments weren't really getting at some of the issues. We would go to investigate and we're like, this isn't, it's not pulling out it's not aligning with some of the stuff we're hearing is going on. Come to find out, the instrument wasn't designed to pull some of those things out. So you'll notice that also in our, when we release our faculty instrument, that there are several questions that are either removed and or replaced for us to be far more intentional in our data collection, right? Because it's easier to hide these things if you don't ask the right question. So we need more robust ways of understanding the experiences of minoritized faculty if our intention is to not only recruit, but retain them in the PA education pipeline. Because think about it, one PA faculty member, right, of representation, and I think about Dr. Susan Salishore's program, right, and how you look at her program, it is so ethnically diverse, right? So she has Black students and Korean students and probably the most Muslim students that are wearing their hijabs, but she has all of those people represented on staff. However, her program is actually an anomaly of everything that is around her in the city and on the campus. And so it is single-handedly how they have developed and designed and how they're intentional through their recruiting, how they're supportive of these students. And you have other students of color or minoritized students from other, health profession majors that are like, well, what are they doing? What are they doing over there that we're not doing? Right. And so I'm saying all of that to say this work is doable, but that doesn't mean that if you're the only one on your campus, you're still dealing with and experiencing a racist environment that wasn't designed nor intended for you to thrive and survive, right? And these are stories that I'm hearing, repeatedly. And so I'm saying all of that to say, what would it mean for us to not have a Caruthers at Meharry? Right? What would that mean for you to now be gone because you've been stressed out of your space and place? Now you're at an HBCU, right? But the conversation can go on and on and on, right? Going back to just what does it mean for us to be diverse individuals? And so we have to think more deeply about the experiences that people are having across the pipeline. We can't stop the conversation at admissions, because what we're seeing is that we get them in. So let's say we fixed the admissions problem, quote unquote. Well, now, and one of our vignettes says, it's from an ally, we've recruited them into a leaky boat that wasn't really intended for them to get to the destination. And right. And it's so every step of the way, you have to ask yourself, how is my environment prepared for those who are underrepresented to not only succeed, but thrive? And here's the thing that people don't get. If you do that, everyone benefits, right? And so I say everyone has a stake in this work. So what would it look like? It means we would have not only an increased retention of them to be faculty, because that we haven't even talked about faculty retention across the board being problematic. But if you start to ask those questions about underrepresented in medicine faculty, you're probably going to have an increase of just retaining faculty, period. Is what we would hope to see. That would also then mean they're impacting health disparities. Like just thinking about, I remember just being pregnant with my own daughter, my last one who's 2, and I remember hearing the statistics that I was more likely to die, not be uncomfortable, be death of childbirth, right? If I did not have a Black healthcare provider. These aren't theoretical, like, I'm just going to be uncomfortable. That's a whole nother layer of this, but it is impacting not only the quality of life, but how long and how we die as Black people, right? And so why do I have a stake in this work? Why is it important for me to think about what am I doing to ensure that we have more minoritized faculty? Because I know that in the long run, it will impact the quality of life of others in different communities. So that would be my hope and dream, is that we can retain them and that we impact the communities that are around us.
Nice. I definitely agree with that, because those are very, sobering statistics. Like, data out there demonstrate that Black women with doctoral degrees, JD, PhD, MD, are more likely to die during childbirth than a white woman who dropped out of high school. And we often think of, oh, well, education is the great equalizer. Education, unfortunately, for Black and brown folks aren't the great equalizer, because we also have to think about the experience we have and what we're being educated on. Because I think that's with this Vignette Project, with what we're trying to do for the profession, for PA education in 50 years, is we have to really think about how we're educating, what we're educating, and to ensure that we're not propagating ideology that's stereotypical, that is supremacist in nature, that is discriminatory. We have to really be mindful. And I think we often don't acknowledge that. And so do you think, and again, this is somewhat theoretical, because, I have hope and belief, but do you think we are ready as an association, as PA educators, to not only have this conversation, but to do the work?
Oh, that's going to be the $1 million question. So as a critical race theorist, I can tell you we're okay with having conversations around these things. But when it comes to really addressing some of the issues, we have yet to talk about white rage or fragility, which are just as prominent in the literature, right? What does it actually mean for us to have equal access? And now you're actually in competition with minoritized faculty. It's okay if you're dealing with equity issues and you're winning, you're above them, you have more than them. We're okay with that. But once you start to tip those scales, people aren't always so happy and so welcoming. And I don't know how we will deal with and contend with some of those things. I think it's through time, building up our allies. Our allies have to be strong. And here's a for example. Right. So thinking about and Lori Patton. So I think she's at Ohio State now, right? So she's, pretty big name in the field when it comes to some of this stuff. She did a study at her institution and she asked minoritized people or Black people in this particular study. She said, who are the most social justice white male faculty? So she went to the pinnacle. Like she said, who are they? Right. She said, give me a list. I want a list of who these folks are, right? It's all in her methods. It's so interesting how she did it, right? Just a curious Black woman. 2012, her as Patton embodied 2012. And what they did was they literally got a list of folks that were Black folks that came up with this list of who were social justice, white faculty on their campus that were men. Then she said, I'm going to ask them, how does this appear in their work? And guess what? There was a mismatch. Black people assume because they were nice to me, they were kind to me, that meant that they were social justice oriented. And we have a lot of work to do to undo some of these things that are going to be tough and they're going to be uncomfortable, right? Because we have a lot of, let's say if we're asking questions, Kara, you literally asked a question. You now are being distracted because you were presumed to be angry, even if you were presumed to be angry and frustrated, but now we're not talking about the problem at hand. Now we're talking about Kara's emotions as if they're your therapist. You know what I'm saying? Like things are so out of pocket that we get distracted. And so where are we? We got a long way to go because people just looking at the data, most programs and institutions have mission statements. And at the same time, we know that these are the same spaces that aren't allocating time. They're not allocating a budget. They're not holding folks accountable. They're not thinking about, well, how is this going to appear in the tenure and promotion process? So if it's not appearing in admissions process. So if you still talk about GREs and GPAs and did you get this grade? And well, how long ago did they need to if you're still, you're finding other ways to reify the same exact system. So where are we? We have a lot of work to undo. And this is all hands on deck, right? And so even on our team, I said, what would it mean for us to never turn a volunteer away? If you wanted to volunteer, you wanted to write with the research team, you wanted to investigate something with the research team, you wanted to promote something or talk about something that is related to DEI, what would it mean for us to never turn you away? Because I understand every single issue. I'm not going to catch it all. I'm not going to catch most of it. Right? But you're going to see it where you are. And what would that mean for us to actually show up and support and think through these things with our members, right? And so that's, I think where we are is problem identification in some places. I think it's intervention in others. We need more intervention studies. We don't have any. We have to do, who's going to do the work and beyond the cherry narratives? Because everybody, when they talk about equity work, they make it sound sweet. It's not. I have to have my own therapist, right? It's hard to listen to these stories and to know that people oftentimes are now calling me because they're like, I now had something happen and I want to share this with you, right? I have to be whole in order to take that in. And there's times where I get emotional and I get frustrated and I'm like, am I moving the needle today? Right? Am I showing up? I can't, there is no off day, right? And then what does that mean for us as a lot of Black faculty, the minority tax, because you're like, I can't take any time off, right? Because people need me to be fully present. They need me to be the top of my game. Do I know everything that I possibly could? And Carrie, you mentioned it before we jumped on, how you talk in citation. right? You got to learn how to talk in citation. Think about how much reading you have to do in order to know that what you're saying is backed up by multiple sources. Right. And so thinking about that, that's a tax, right? We can't just say whatever. No, it has to be backed up by something. So I'm saying all that to say I'm not sure we're I'm not as I did a presentation. I'll stop here just a second. I did a presentation for the PA's lead group. And I referred to this diversity work is we are talking about the snowflake on the top of the iceberg. That's where we are. The snowflake on the top. We have so much work to do, and we're not gonna, in some cases, webinar our way out of this. Who's gonna be uncomfortable and do the work? So we have a long way to go.
Woo, so that was a perfect segue into this year's theme, which I was very intentional this year, thinking about immediate past President Statler. Her theme was wellness. And then past President Straker was looking at DEI. And so one of the reasons I wanted us to focus on justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and wellness this year is really to your point. We cannot be well if we don't have justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We can't have justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion if we also don't combine it with wellness. Like, it can't happen. Like, both are imperative for both. So it's a synergistic effect. So I'm gonna go back to my wet bench research, basic science, and I was looking at a synergistic effect of one chemical on some cells and all this good stuff. So really, wellness and JEDI work will have a synergistic effect on really how we want PA education to look, how we want that to be the experience for our students, the experience for our staff, and the experience for our faculty. Because, you know, I am so happy that as much as we somewhat have disdain for the ARC PA, they are doing necessary work, right, for us to stay accredited, for us to train the next generation, or this current generation of clinicians. But I am so happy that there is the diversity standard, A111. Glad it's there, because that was also 20 years in the making. And so we can't wait 20 additional years for us to make traction and movement on this, the same way we're required now to talk about burnout, to talk about wellness, to be able to, on our websites, talk about resources students have available, staff have available, faculty have available for wellness. Because what this pandemic that we are yet in, 2 years and some change, what has demonstrated is normal has not been a place of wellness for us. A lot of us have been working. A lot of us have been burning both ends of the candle. We've been pouring for a cup that is bone dry. We can't even say it's empty, it's bone dry. And we've been pouring from it. And at some point, for certain faculty, there's nothing left to give. And that leads to burnout. That leads to, we know, particularly in academic medicine specifically, the last 2 years, the number of prominent Black women in academic medicine, MDs, who have left academic medicine because of these systems. And we have these wonderful statements and we have these mission statements, but there's no teeth to it. And so I think it also, you know, with this Vignette Project, with the upcoming strategic plan that we're rolling out, is we want to be intentional. We can't just use words, but it is, what is the work that we're willing to commit to really make this experience good for everyone? Because wellness isn't me attending a meditation session. While I enjoy a good yoga therapy, for me, you know, I have a chronic illness, and so doing yoga actually helps me with my mobility and some things. Oh, love a good yoga session. Oh, I can do the downward dog. I can do the little stretching. Wonderful. But that is not going to make me well when I'm constantly succumbing to microaggressions, macroaggressions, or really what I think a lot of people don't even consider, where I'm not even seen. So I'm not even acknowledged. So like to the point you had made before about, we want students not to just come to a program where we can say, oh, well, this is the most diverse class. We want a student to do more than survive. We want them to thrive. As a faculty member, I want to thrive because the experiences that I have, the education that I have is valuable to training the next clinician. And so we're not going to meditate our way out of into wellness. We're not going to meditate our way into justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, but there is intentionality. And so definitely appreciative for this vignette project, even the conversation of how it got started, because that is the intentional work that we have to do. And you know, to your point about some of the things that we can do as programs, yes, we know what the data says. Yes, we know that we got some work to do. What are some, you addressed a little bit about admissions, but what are some other practical suggestions that you could give to program leadership, PDs, admissions counselors? What are some practical things that we literally can do now?
Absolutely. And so one of the things we also noticed from this rapid response data is that people may or may not be aware of the DEI toolkit. Not to say it is an all-inclusive, it's going to hit on all of your concerns. However, there's a significant drop-off as it relates to going over to the best practices document. So that's what I would say is, do they do both, right? So are you looking at the DEI toolkit, and then are you crosswalking it over to the best practices document? That's to me more of like the meat and potatoes. What does it look like in admissions and the resources? What does it look like in faculty retention? And we know that these things need to be built out, and we're still working on that. So this is going to take a community. So that would be like the first tangible thing I would say. I would then ask yourself as a program, what does it look like here at every step of the way? What does it look like when we're hiring faculty? What does it look like in the search committees? What does it look like in the admissions process? Like we want to pick one problem and just kind of like leave it at, okay, well, we're just going to tackle it here. The problem is it occurs at every step of the way. And if you're not doing that level of work, it allows you to reify, and then you not only reify the problems, but then you now have, again, that analogy of you've recruited students into a leaky boat. Well, if the boat is leaky for the students, what makes you think it's not leaky for the faculty? And then there are trends across the profession that people are not staying that long, right? They come in, you know, you guys are trained clinicians. Wonderful, great at that. Now, when you're the academy, now they're talking about research agendas and, you know, going after grants and promotion and tenure and, you know, engaging in a way that you wouldn't have as a student, right? So how is the institution providing support so that not only you're in those spaces, but you're successful, right? So are we paying attention to how much service are you actually doing? You should not be coming in the door thinking about service, right? And so how we can think about what are we actually measuring and valuing in the tenure and promotion process. If we say DEI and all these things are important to us, but we don't have a measure and we're not accounting for it, so then all those things that many minoritized faculty and their allies do, it becomes invisible work. And that invisible work goes into the burnout. Why? Because we have not prioritized that. So when you're thinking about burnout, you have to ask yourself in this space, thinking about both things, right? So not only how minoritized people are existing, right? But then, Carrie, you always bring in that piece of wellness. They can be present, but if they can't show up as their authentic self, think about what that means. If they share with you an issue that happens and you didn't listen or respond, think about the psychological effect on an individual when that happens repeatedly, right? So this racialized trauma and stress. So if you were to ask me what were some tangible things to do, are you doing climate surveys? A lot can come out there. It's not just take the survey and then share the results. What is it now going to do to inform the work that needs to be done? So looking at your data will tell you. Do you talk to and listen to the voices of minoritized folks? They will better inform the work that you're doing. How are things going? How was that admissions process for you? How was this, if we were to redo this faculty search, what would you have liked to have done differently? What would you like to be different in the tenure promotion process? The problem is we may listen, but then we don't implement any of those changes. So we do a lot of listening sometimes, but then what do you do with that information once you're in the know, right? So thinking about that scene in the Matrix, now you know what is your responsibility to then adjust. And that's another thing programs aren't doing. They either don't have many of them don't have milestones, they don't have benchmarks, but then when they hit a pain spot, we got to readjust. Again, a lot of programs aren't doing that. So that's what I would say is, what data are you using to not only benchmark yourself, but to adjust and flex and change direction or pivot if you need to.
So I'm going to add something, and this is going to seem very simplistic because I think what you mentioned is very critical. But one thing that I have heard, I continue to hear in PA education, that I think if we could grapple with this and deconstruct it, I think we would be more open to make change. And that is, we have often equated diversity with two things: lowering standards and struggle. And I think if we were to stop, because our business colleagues since the 70s, there are thousands of studies that talk about why diverse perspectives from gender to race to religion, why that is imperative to each of our learning. If we could stop there and acknowledge, man, that's some flawed logic, talking about slippery slopes, because again, I have been in PA education 12 years. At this point, I have taught well over 1,000 students. The students that I've seen dismissed from a program don't look like me. And so, but we have this narrative, we have this mantra in our heads. Well, if they're diverse, they're gonna struggle. We gonna have to lower the standards. Or we also create some very intentional bias by, as we look at the undergraduate institutions our students, our applicants go to, we rank them by their rigor. I'm gonna call it out, that's discriminatory. So I'm gonna say to all my PA educators out there, if you're doing it at the program, challenge that. Because those books that rank, what are they going by? It's popularity contests, we know. It's how much money you donate. Those aren't good metrics. And I'm really gonna hopefully ruffle some feathers in a good way. I think also, if we are not accepting students going to community colleges, we are doing a disservice, and we are discriminating against students. There are so many states that allow students when they are seniors in high school to do dual enrollment. There are students who come from families that do not have money. And so going to a community college to start their post-secondary education training is best for them. Because while I would love to win mega millions and send all the little children to college, a 4-year institution, pay for it myself, I cannot. That is not the way my wealth line is set up. But that also is, I think, when we're looking at our undergraduate student population. So from the 2015-2016 academic school year, 56% of students were first generation. And this was 5 years ago now, right? 5-6 years ago. And of those students, something like 29% of those students, neither parent had any post-secondary education. And so when we think about what first generation means, neither parent has a degree. And there's a significant number of those students, they're also the first sibling to go. So they don't have a blueprint. So they're figuring it out. So them going to community college to, okay, well, I know I got to work, pay for school, let me go half-time, let me take this. We're now excluding those students from our profession because we have this antiquated thought process of community college. And you know, because I like some numbers. There also, so AAMC came out with a report in October of 2018. And they were looking at medical students and their family, if you will, wealth, their family income. 20, what is it? I'm on look, so you're gonna see me looking off screen so I get the numbers right. 5% of matriculating med students from 2007 to 2017, their family income was less than $24,000. But 25% of matriculating medical students' family income was more than $225,000, which is upper 5% of all wealth in this country, right? So 77% of medical students, 2007 to 2017, their family income was almost higher than $75,000. So when we're thinking about recruiting students, again, now let's be clear, I am not equating minoritized students with poverty and not having money. Two separate things, but two separate things we also have to think about, because that is resources. Like, I have had students that were selling their plasma to afford food. What do we have at our institutions for students who they can't call their mother and ask for money? And again, that's not begrudging anyone's financial situation, but I know as PA educators, as we're recruiting students, whether it's students that are from rural areas, right, that are, we know, under-resourced public school systems, may not have access, right? I'm in Tennessee, and the Appalachian Mountains and the poverty, the impoverishment that's there is very real, right? So what do I have on my campus to make sure if I have a student that's struggling financially, can I get them food? Am I aware of the financial aid resources that my students have access to? Because what a lot of us also aren't being mindful of, because of how we're categorized as PAs, our education system, we're capped much lower at federal student loan money we can borrow than MDs, DOs, even Masters of Public Health. Like, it's almost $100,000 difference, which means our students now have to take out private loan money, and you have to have a certain credit score to do that, right? And so if you come from a family where your family income is less than $24,000, so thinking about poverty rates, one person, you make $12,000 a year, you are on the poverty scale. So let alone 24,000. That's significant. And so what resources should we have? Should we be thinking about? Should we publish? Should we know in the communities? Is there a food pantry nearby? Is there, if there isn't healthcare on campus that is accessible to the students, what free clinics are nearby your campus where you can participate in? Do you have an emergency fund for your students if the apartment they live in gets burned, right? Like, we need to also think about this, because yes, there's the diversity piece that we absolutely need to. There's also other layers, from financial resources, first gen, not having a blueprint. There's all of these things that we just aren't considering, and we definitely need to, if we are intentional about the progress that we want to make. And I know I said a whole lot, but I'll let you add anything.
No, I think you're bringing out the complexity of it, right? And thinking about, we talk about holistic admissions, right? So you're talking about what is holistic support for students, from application from applicant to graduate. And then what does it mean to have holistic support for faculty, right? The different ways in which the universities can show up, or the institutions can show up and provide support. So I think it's a lot of work. When you think about it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so heavy. Where do I even get started? I would say, for those of you that feel like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed, where do I start? I would just say, the thing that is standing out to you the most, that you become passionate about, that issue that you notice, is the best place to start. You don't have to be the most knowledgeable. You just have to be committed. and then finding your people, as you will, right? And I think one of the things we also can go back to the business literature. We think it takes, you have to convince everybody to join you in order to shift the culture. No, 10%. Which means if you have, let's say, 100 people in your program to actually shift the culture, you only need 10 people, right? So we actually need a lot less than what we think. So I would say just identify your group and then just be committed to working on a particular issue. And then create milestones for yourself, because this work can become very, very taxing, right? Like, how are you going to celebrate your successes, right? Who is your source of support as you're kind of going through and engaging and learning about these things? So I would just say this work is very, very doable. It's very, very fulfilling. And if you're not sure where to start, I highly recommend that you reach out to the DEI toolkit, look at the best practices document, but just knowing that we know that this is not all inclusive. If something is not available, we can learn to create it, or you'll create it yourself and we share it with members, right? So everyone has a role and a place and a purpose in this work.
Absolutely. And what the other thing that I'm really excited that you are on board with PAEA, Monica, is the work that you're doing, the work that you're prompting us to do. We now have a space to house it. We have the Digital Learning Hub. How about that? So I'm sure many people will be watching this on the Digital Learning Hub, but I think it is incumbent upon us to use that, because that is a phenomenal resource that you may not have the language to talk about. Man, we really need to do some tweaking and really redo our admissions policy. There are knowledgeable folks within PA education that have some best practices. They have examples of what to do. And there is some information that is housed on the Digital Learning Hub, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. Because I'm encouraged, because I did not know that 10%. That makes my soul happy, because that means 1 in 10 of us. So if some people ain't comfortable right now, we just need 1 out of 10. 1 out of 10, come on now, 1 out of 10 to make change. So again, I shared this with somebody in a conversation earlier this morning. I teach my students, when we talk about medical inequity, we talk about racial injustice in medicine, how that looks. The students also say, man, but Miss C, man, that's a lot. I mean, and this is what I tell them. Like, if you've ever skipped rocks, like on the lake, on the stream or whatever, you get a decent sized one, right? Now, if you really want to make a big splash, at least in a swimming pool, you're going to cannonball. But here's what we often don't think about. If all of us had a little pebble and we all threw it in the stream, all threw it in the pond, we still making ripples. If enough of us, that 10%, throw our little pebble in the pond, man, tidal wave is a coming. So I hope our fellow PA educators, our colleagues, as you're watching this, I hope that you are encouraged. I know that we see you, we acknowledge you. As we've talked about PAEA being a family, we are interconnected. We cannot deviate from that. We are, and you'll hear me say it again several times this year, we are stronger together than we are apart. And so it really just needs a commitment to see the racism that exists, the commitment to say, hey, when I say something, I'm going to speak up, and I'm going to ensure that I am not propagating this mentality in the work that I do, how I engage with my colleagues, how I engage with potential students and current students. So I appreciate your time, Dr. Miles. As always, we have such fantastic conversations, and we can go on for more hours, but we're going to stop. So I appreciate your time.